and welcome to Africa Today. I am Esther Mokwariola. For those who often take time out to keep tabs on news developments, night time in Africa comes with a chance to reflect on the world as it is, where statistics show that on the average, 20 people are driven from their homes every minute. That is 1 in every 3 seconds, less than the time it took me to read my opening sentence. From South Sudan to Burundi, Central African Republic to Democratic Republic of Congo, thousands are forced to flee their homes every day and bear the brunt of a conflict that defies logic. And so we ask, what are your thoughts on the plight of refugees and internally displaced persons in Africa as we reflect on this year's World Refugee Day? You can join the conversation and share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TVC News NG. We take a report and Africa Today will continue. Welcome on board.
Somali refugee Adel Sheikh Aden was ridiculed when he started gathering empty plastic water bottles, broken buckets and old jerrycans around one of the world's largest refugee camps.
We are refugee and we don't have any money, so we continue our work. That's why we continue our work.
Having fled war in Somalia, Aden is part of a small group of displaced persons who have taken up the fight against plastic waste generated in Dabab, from which he also earns an income. Dabab's waste recycling project, set up by the Kenya Red Cross Society just over a year ago, has only 8 refugee staff. But initial results are promising and the plan is to grow.
Dadaab is one of the biggest refugee camp in the world, and for that reason the population is also quite big. It generates quite an amount of waste.
In a cement and iron building equipped with plastic shredder and compressor, the refugees have recycled about 6 tons of plastic waste so far, generating some $1,580 in revenue alone. Nelly Saiti of the Kenyan Red Cross says plastic recycling has huge potential as a sustainable business for refugees. She also says it could be a model for other large camps such as Bidi in Uganda, Kakuma in Kenya, as well as Nyarugusu in Tanzania.
If we engaged the refugee community and the host community, who are the biggest generators of the waste, then it would be an income generating activity for the population, as well as a form of environmental protection.
Situated about 300 miles east of Kenya's capital, Nairobi, Dabab is home to more than 200,000 refugees, largely from Somalia, whom depend on aid. The settlement, spread more than 300 square kilometers of semi-arid desert land, has schools, hospitals, markets, police stations, graveyards, and a bus station.
On December the 4th, 2000, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution proclaiming that, with effect from 2001, June the 20th should be marked as World Refugee Day. 2015 United Nations Agency reports show that Africa is the most affected of the more than 65 million refugees around the world, where about almost 20 million people are either displaced or forced to flee their home countries. Joining me on Skype, I have Dr. Uche Igwe, Doctorate Research Fellow, University of Sussex, United Kingdom. I also have on Skype Dr. Martin Erwi, Senior Researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, Pretoria, in South Africa. Good to have you both on the program.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Now, let me begin with you now, Dr. Uche Igwe. Today, we're celebrating World Refugee Day. And of course, we understand the plight of refugees around the world. Tell me now, what do you think we've been doing right or wrong in the past years?
Well, I think that I would like to start with what we have not been doing right. I think that in that regard, we are all guilty of limited political will and sincerity to the issue of what I call a global refugee crisis. Today, 68.5 million people are either refugees or internally displaced persons. And that's a huge number. And out of that number, about 26% or so, 18 million persons precisely, according to the UN statistics, come from Africa. That is a huge number. And I think that we need to increase the political will, both from developed and developing countries. That is the first thing. The second thing is that we should also provide clarity. There is this hasty labeling and narrative that refugees, for instance, maybe because of the numbers, is a developing country thing or an African thing. I think that is not exactly the case. As is defined by the United Nations, conflict can occur anywhere, but that we are sort of on the receiving side of a higher number of conflict should not make anyone, for that matter, begin to conclude that refugees is an African thing. So first, we need increase in political will. Second is that we need clarity, and we need to reduce labeling on the issue of the refugee crisis. We need to see it as a global problem that deserves global solutions, and we need to get every country developed and developing to come on board to make this happen.
Now, Martin Ewe, part of why these refugees leave their countries are either due to war, persecution, and of course conflict. Now with this, hope for these refugees, what other ways do you think we can help these ones who have left their countries return, knowing that their countries are still unstable for them to go back?
Yeah, thank you. I think that the drivers of or the causes of refugees are changing. Conflict, as you said, traditionally used to be the main driver, the main cause of refugees in Africa and elsewhere. But what we are seeing recently is that there are some emergent issues, such as terrorism, violent extremism, and other unconventional crises that are the main result, the main cause of refugees nowadays, particularly internally displaced persons. And therefore, which means that if I were to respond to your previous question is, are we doing enough to address the current challenges or the current issues that led to refugees in Africa and the world at large? Certainly no. And my focus on Africa is really that, as Uche has said, there seems to be some sort of a dichotomy in the African mind, which seem to see that we are the producers of refugees, but those who support them are supposed to be Europeans. And I think this has to change if we really want to address the fundamental causes of refugees in Africa. What we have also seen in recent years is that the government have been part of the problem, because many of the refugees we see nowadays are caused by government because of their responses to this emerging crisis in Africa. So, and therefore, I think we need to pose that question to ourselves to see where we have been inadequate in terms of addressing the problems and where we have new triggers of refugees in Africa and the world at large.
And if we're to look at this matter closely, would you say that most of these refugees are ready to come back, even if we are to get things done rightly in our countries?
Well, certainly, refugees, again, if these are people who have been forced to leave their homes, not migrants who, decide to leave their homes for other reasons. Refugees have been forced by war, by factors inconveniencing them at home. So these are people who are always willing to come back, to go back home. And I think that should be our main target, to bring them back home. So the barometer for measuring how successful we are should actually be how many have we resettled back in their countries of origin or hometowns.
All right, let's quickly go on a very quick break. You're watching Africa Today, and we've been looking at the plight of refugees and internally displaced persons in Africa as we reflect on this year's World Refugee Day. Welcome back. In recent years, the civil war in Somalia became the huge factor for a high number of refugees in the region, where the lingering conflicts in South Sudan have grown to become one of the worst humanitarian crises in modern history. Well, years of Boko Haram insurgency in Nigeria has led to the deaths of thousands, and left millions of people displaced. Now, Dr. Uche Igwe, if we're to look at those who are refugees in their own countries, so much yet so little has been done for them. How do you think now, with all this, different help, assistance for these ones, can help them to, pursue a better life? Because how far can these foundations go in terms of making their life better? We have foundations for education, we have foundations for health in these countries where they ought to provide them, without any complaint whatsoever. How do you think they can keep up with this provision without any challenges, as it were?
Well, technically speaking, you cannot be a refugee in your own country. You can only be an internally displaced person. So speaking to the issue of internally displaced persons in the country, I think what is critical is to try to address and possibly eliminate the issues that led to their displacement in the first instance. We have seen the issue of Boko Haram insurgency lingering, unfortunately, despite the efforts of the security agencies. We learned a couple of days ago that there was another successful suicide bombing. And again, the dynamics of all of these conflicts are changing, especially with the issue of suicide bombing. So I think what is important is whether and to what extent the remote causes of the displacement have been addressed. And that's the first thing. The second thing is the kind of responses and the kind of care, for instance, that's given to these internally displaced persons where they are. Because unless and until those issues that displace them are adequately addressed, it might just mean that wherever they are at the moment will be their home for some weeks and months to come. So we need to start, focusing on the issues and the conditions prevalent in these, internal displaced persons, the IDP camps, as it were.
Yeah.
I think that, there's something I describe as a conflict economy. Sometimes, there is a lot of multiplicity of donor agencies, NGOs, and that is almost an industry, as it were. But, I think that it is critical for us to understand how much of these humanitarian support actually trickle down to the internal displaced persons.
Right.
What is their condition as we speak? Otherwise, we'll begin to sort of allow those who have decided to create, of course, there's always an economy, out of all of these, to begin to, you see multiplicity of government agencies, multiplicity of donor agencies, addressing the same issue. So I think that it is important to pause and review, how far and to what extent, this has impacted on critical issues, like water and sanitation, for instance, even housing, as it were, how many people are supposed to be in these ID camps, how many people are there at the moment, and even some kind of tactical issues. Like, for instance, there was a time we heard that, there have been attacks, even in the IDP camps. So I think that, we need to separate two things. First is that we must address the remote causes of the conflict. It's lingered for a while. Second is that we must begin to look at the critical issues of welfare and the situation in these IDP camps. And we must open up the conflict economy, open up those, who want to make industry out of what is going on, so that at the end of the day, we will become effective as a government, and also track resources that have gone into these areas. If you recall, there has been all kinds of scandals, that have come up in the past. What has happened to all those who were one way or the other mentioned to have done things, that are not right with, the IDP camps and all of that? It is only when government decisively deals with those issues, prosecutes people who are involved, that that the kind of signal, that will be sent very clearly that the lives of IDPs matter, and that in the future, for instance, when the issues that caused their displacement are eliminated, they have a hope of remaining alive and possibly returning to their homes.
Let me quickly come to Martin Elway. Martin Elway, we understand that some of these refugees, for the sake of security in some countries, they've been limited. There's a ceiling, there's a cap. So they don't take in much more that they can handle. For instance, you have the case in the United States and, of course, in Germany and other countries like that. But in a situation where refugees are being used as terrorists or being used as terrorist targets, how can we separate these two, protecting the refugees and, of course, protecting them against being used as tools to perpetrate criminal acts that, further term them or tag them as elements not capable of sustaining an economy or a country, or causing more harm than good altogether?
Yeah, I think Uche has rightly described the plight of refugees. Look, it's the worst situation to be in, and I think that we never really grasp it until we are part of it. Because we seem to see refugees as, poor people who are, who have left everything. Yes, it is true. They've lost their livelihood. They've lost almost everything that could make them human. And this is, for me, the cause of this is really the failure of government to exercise the right to protect. Each and every government, particularly African countries that sign on to the African Union Constitutive Act, have the responsibility to protect people, to protect citizens. That means even in situations of conflict. By the way, governments are supposed to take measures to prevent those conflicts from occurring or to mitigate the impact of such crisis on people from getting into that drifting lives of refugees. Now you've described the situation, one very appalling situation where they are exploited by terror groups or by rebel groups, used again as part of the conflict, which means that when somebody is driven off his home or somebody who has lost his livelihood, that's not the end. The person continues to be at risk, to be vulnerable to the same factors that drive the conflict. We've seen Boko Haram has used this to the extent that, nowadays we're talking of refugees and terrorism. That didn't used to happen because now terrorist groups are now exploiting, the refugees. They're exploiting displaced people, to perpetrate their acts. They use them for recruitment. They use them to traffic drugs. They use them for all sorts of things, to the extent that refugees have become very suspicious, and many countries have become so reluctant, to even accommodate them. So it's really a life that we really need to protect these people. So the moment people are into that life of refugees, I think it should be the top responsibility of government, to stretch their own limit to protect these individuals and to do everything possible to resettle them or to bring them back to their homes, because this is the most horrible situation a human being can find himself in, because you don't have a home, you don't have anything, you live in conditions that are inhuman. So, and therefore, really, for us to commemorate this day, I think we should think of the plight, the horror that some people, human beings, go through. And these are people who were wealthy, these were people who were making a living, but who have been driven from their livelihood by violent crisis.
And now talking about resettling these refugees, still on you, Martin Elway, it's more or less a Herculean process in countries where they seek asylum. For instance, in the United States right now, it is really, really tough for refugees trying to resettle over there. And talking about other countries too, well, they have some, open windows for migrants to come in, or refugees, as you like to put it. How can we scale up admittance of refugees in countries where they seek asylum, taking away the fears that some countries have that they could be terrorist targets or being used as a tool? How can we scale up the admittance in countries where they seek asylum?
Yeah, no, international law is very clear on that. To also really delineate the ambiguity that's often cloud, the situation of refugees and countries hosting them and so on and so forth, because there has always been that tendency to be suspicious of people fleeing conflict. We see these people to bring this conflict with them to the host countries. We see these people, to carry all sort of things that are not necessary for their host countries. And therefore, international law has come up with measures for government to take, because you cannot turn somebody down who is in desperate need of a place secure enough for that person to make a living. Remember, the right of life is the most cherished human right, which each and every person should have. So therefore, if an individual is looking for life somewhere in your own country, you have the responsibility, the obligation to accept this person, to accord this person asylum. But there are criteria to eliminate fears or that belief that this individual might be coming in with things or with sentiment or anything that could jeopardize your own peace. The international law has stated, various measures that government should take, which is one being just verify those who are coming to your country, verify the individuals who are requesting for asylum, to make sure that they themselves are not terrorists, they themselves are not rebels or people who were participating actively in the war. So, and therefore, if a country can take these measures to check, just to double check, there is nothing else that you should be afraid of these individuals. And by giving this person, like we've seen in the U.S., the refugees that came from Germany, they came from Ireland, many of them became top scholars. They became people who contributed a lot to the economy, to the well-being of America today. So, and therefore, refugees are not always these people who bring burden on the country. They also bring resources. They bring a lot, in some cases, to their host country. So we shouldn't, look at refugees and be afraid, and always think of the burden on us, think that they're coming to grab our jobs. Some of them are coming with resources that, they themselves, they just need that space and peacefulness for them to really blossom in their own ideas.
Now, for Dr. Uche Igwe, looking at the refugees right now, we're commemorating, I stand with refugees at this time as we commemorate World Refugee Day. But what is the hope for them on a larger scale? Do you think perhaps the world will recognize these individuals as same of the same and not different people from a different background or a different society that ravaged by war, conflict, and all of that?
Well, I like to say two things in particular. The first is that we must understand, as part of this political will I talk about, that refugee rights are human rights. IDP rights are human rights.
Right.
We have had cases where even aid workers themselves have, exploited. I mean, we've had cases of sexual exploitation, for instance, in some of these IDP camps. And we have had all kinds of treatment given to people who, one way or the other, are trying to leave their countries to other countries. I think that the global hypocrisy about human rights of refugees or migrants being a different set of rights is something every person we must all come together to condemn. And that's the first thing. The second thing also is that we must criticize the fact that some people dubiously elect to be refugees. And that is why the standard that my colleague talked about is crucial. Today, the last time I looked at the figures, more than 3,000 people died crossing over from Africa to Europe, through the Mediterranean. You and I know that not all of these people are displaced by conflict or circumstances that classify them as refugees.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of education that needs to happen on both sides. People should not, for instance, rise up from their countries and do one thing or the other and start heading through very, very dangerous routes in search of the so-called greener pasture. So it is important that international standards are clear so that it will be easy to differentiate who is a refugee, who is a migrant, and who is an economic migrant, as it were. So I think that clarity will be very crucial. And then it is also important to define clear standards of human rights. that will operate when a genuine refugee is involved, and also a genuine internally displaced person. So these things are crucial.
All right, unfortunately, we can't continue with that because of the line failure on
It is
that.
something
Okay.
that should be captured very clearly internationally.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Uche Igwe. We appreciate your contribution on Africa today as well. I'd like to thank my guest from Pretoria, South Africa, Martin Ewe. Thank you too for your contribution on Africa today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
While the world pushes towards a better life for all, Africa is struggling to be responsible and responsive to the plight of refugees under conditions where institutions are weak, infrastructure is degrading, and investment is poor. Amidst a senseless campaign of brutality that keeps displacing lives and destroying livelihoods, the future of the continent largely depends on purpose-driven, forward-thinking leadership where hope is more than a word and home is more than a wish. And that is our package for today. But don't forget to join the conversation on Twitter at TVC News NG, and also follow me for updates around Africa at Esther TVC News. Until the next one, I am Esther Omokwariola, and always remember, Africa can only get better.